woke up one morning noticing a little pain in his right arm. The pain seemed to have continued from the day earlier, but being full of positivity, Jerry dismissed it and immediately started off his day with a cup of coffee while reading the morning papers. To him, everything was going as usual until his wife Mary asked him why he was holding the papers with one hand. Jerry simply smiled and asked if she was pulling a prank on him, saying that as his wife, she should be well aware that he had lost his arm in a childhood accident. Mary was a bit confused, but she still was too tired to even understand, so she ignores him and went to the kitchen, prepared breakfast, and called her husband to the table so they could eat together. It didn't take long for Mary to notice that her husband was still making use of one arm even while eating. Jerry is naturally right-handed, but to see him continually use only his left hand made Mary a bit uncomfortable. This time, with a clear mind, she insisted that Jerry elaborate more on his earlier story about how he lost his arm. But for some reason, Jerry refused to answer it, claiming it was a horrible experience for him. The next day, Mary woke up to probably the strangest thing she had ever seen. On his left hand, Jerry held up a newspaper to his face, fully focused on the results of yesterday's football game. All the while, his right hand wrote some spontaneous text with a pen on the sofa. At first, Mary thought she was probably seeing things, so she went straight into the bathroom to give her face a quick wash. But when she got back and took another look at Jerry, she held her face in shock right after noticing his right arm had completely left its socket. For one thing, she couldn't believe the event that SCP-187 had foretold her about her husband would actually have happened, and for another, she had to accept her fate. In a saddened state, Mary picked up her phone, called the person labeled X, and tearfully looked at her husband one last time. Greetings, my like-minded comrades. My name is Detective Nicolette, and in case you are wondering about what happened to Jerry, well, his wife Mary was an SCP personnel, and she was among the first people under the supervision of SCP-187. But at the time, the subject apparently saw the eventual outcome of Jerry's life, but that's besides the case. Long story short, Jerry was eventually contained in an SCP holding cell while they studied the anomaly that affected him, or as it was labeled, SCP-1656, also known as jealous limbs. The subject belongs to the Euclid class, perhaps because it doesn't cause any harm or inconvenience to the affected individual, even though the limbs parted ways with their body. However, despite being fully aware of its presence, the Foundation still doesn't have a solid containment procedure for SCP-1656. Part of this could be because both the mechanism and the method of activation are still very much unknown, at least to the Foundation standards. That being said, the Foundation still feels the need to contain and study the limbs, or instances, of SCP-1656-1, as they are called. These instances are kept in a standard 1 by 1 by 1 meter holding cell at Site-28. Employees are also advised to administer nutrients and fluids into the subjects intravenously at least once a day. The anomaly called SCP-1656 is best described as an idiopathic phenomenon which affects the upper limbs of adult human beings. It manifests in a series of stages from the time the person is affected by it till the affected limb eventually becomes an instance. On the first stage, all subjects or parent instances affected by SCP-1656 start to experience a series of muscle pain, dulled sensation, and reduced blood circulation in the affected limb. And while this is ongoing, the parent instances also receive a massive altercation in their memories. Studies show that all the affected subjects reported that the affected limb was amputated a long time ago at a relatively young age. When questioned about why they aren't using the affected limb, they simply claim that they can't use what they don't have. However, when the parent instances are asked to elaborate more on how they lost the limb, they all refuse to answer the question. In the second stage, the subject experiences a periodic loss of voluntary motor control over the affected limb. Over time, the intensity of these losses increases until the affected limb attains complete anatomy, which we earlier described as an instance of SCP-1656-1. These instances are regarded as sapient beings, and during the time of its anatomy, SCP-1656-1 was always seen making attempts at communicating with the parent instances, or at least trying to get their attention. Some observers even related the ordeal to that of a recently married couple. However, despite all attempts by SCP-1656-1 to gain their attention, the parent instances always ignored them irrespective of whichever communication means was used. All recovered communications always showed that the limbs felt rejected and neglected by their parents, but after 12 to 14 days, the limbs divert their communications towards an unidentified male individual, stating that it will end its relationship with the parent instances, and this period marks the transition to the third and final stage. Here, SCP-1656-1 cleanly separates itself from the shoulder of its parent instance, leaving behind what looks like a fully healed stump at the site of its removal. Observers also report that neither the parent nor the limb experienced any deleterious effects during and after the process. All instances of SCP-1656-1 are able to move freely by hopping from one spot to another. And apparently after separation, these subjects immediately make an attempt to flee to an unobserved area. If an observer completely loses sight of SCP-1656-1, the subject abruptly disappears to an unknown location. Strangely enough, all GPS monitoring systems placed in the instances prior to their separation are cut off immediately after visual observation is lost. At first, when I was studying this subject, my first guess as to its origin was another SCP subject, SCP-2988, better known as Folly of the Fruit Eater. The subject is a tree with several human and animal limbs. Whenever a victim tries to escape the tree, the limbs either subdue the person or detach themselves from the tree and chase the victim. After running through the phenomenon of SCP-1656, I initially thought that the tree was actually the birthplace of those affected limbs, and they were simply returning to their natural habitat, but I immediately dismissed that thought after the limbs made reference to an unknown male individual. It may be that this individual is just a hoax and the tree created to entice the limbs into leaving the parent's body, but I don't believe that to be the case, because for one thing, it doesn't explain how SCP-1656-1 attained complete anatomy in the first place. Desperate for answers, I scanned through the Foundation's archives for SCP subjects who attract or collect human limbs, from which I found quite a lot. One of them, which was SCP-1155, aka the predatory street art. The subject looks like a regular street graffiti artwork until a victim comes with striking range of the subject. The victims' bodies are never found, but the Foundation did get a glimpse on where the bodies were kept. Well, not the bodies, but the limbs and several other body parts of the victims, but this still doesn't connect well with SCP-1656 and its instances. It would seem that despite the number of limb lovers in the SCP family, I clearly didn't get a reliable result with a close resemblance to that of SCP-1656. As much as it pained me, I had to first read through the whole data on SCP-1656 before coming up with a potential theory on how it came about, which is not something I pride myself on, but to know the truth, I must swallow my pride and get it with. So reluctantly, I looked through the first recovered data, tagged SCP-1656-A. It was a log which was created on the 12th of April 2010. It seems that after all the GPS trackers seemingly deactivated after the limbs disappeared, the said GPS trackers also reactivated spontaneously, and the signal was tracked to an abandoned warehouse in Mykolaiv, Ukraine. Foundation agents reportedly searched the warehouse over 200 deceased instances of SCP-1656-1, many of which were already in an advanced state of decay. They also found a significant amount of graffiti on the walls of the warehouse, which looked like the communication patterns made by SCP-1656-1. Further investigations also revealed that a person had previously lived in the warehouse, but the site was so far from human observation that no one within the closest vicinity even knew there was a warehouse there. At this point, I was already leaning towards a possible hypothesis, but I needed more leverage, so I opened the next log titled SCP-1656-B. Although this log was a bit weird and didn't contain much information, it did answer some of my questions, considering all it contained was the graffiti written words by the instances, which read the following: "I was wrong. Please take me back. He lied. You were the one. And I still love you. I was able to deduct the possibility that perhaps the male individual might not be an SCP subject, but probably someone who got a hold of some SCP properties. I immediately changed my search focus on the Foundation archives to limb-altering subjects, which I got a couple of results, but I found one in particular to be the most accurate. It is currently labeled SCP-3484, aka Missing Pieces. The subject is a book which contains methods and principles on how to perfectly disassemble and reassemble a human body without the use of any tool. The humans feel no pain during this process, and the removed limbs tends to maintain its functionality status. The book was under the guidance of Dr. Roderick Argent and some D-Class employees, all of whom were tasked with finding possible means to improve the human body by interchangeable limbs. Although I am not exactly certain, I do believe that some of this knowledge was stolen by probably a D-Class employee or Dr. Roderick Argent himself for personal benefit. My theory is that the page he escaped the Foundation using techniques he learned from the book, and is now looking for ways to protect himself by testing other limbs. However, this does raise a question though. Did the thief actually target specific people for his experiment, or is he just stealing limbs at random? I certainly hope it's not random, because I may have to go visit the doctor whenever I noticed even the slightest pain on my arm. Also, my whole theory on the book still isn't clear on why the limbs felt emotionally connected to their host, which means I once again need your help. How do you think the limbs get their emotional connection? Who, perhaps, is the mystery man? Share your thoughts in the comment section like this video, and subscribe to the channel to avoid the possibility of SCP-1656. And I will see you in the next one. Farewell.